Hi again. So in the last video, we organized all of the inputs to feed into our window in the most organized way that we could, and have the modifications that we make in the window feed out back into our script and have that run on our definition instead of the inputs from Grasshopper directly. So now all of our inputs are working quite well and very neatly, and anybody can just hop in and start to change things and not have to fiddle around with wires and zooming in and out of a weird definition. And you might even be able to show this to a client and have them play around over a Rhino window. So that's already working much, much better. But now what we want to do is start to organize our outputs. So what information do we get out of our definition and we display here? So once again, we might not even want to have our Rhino window open and just have this window as the sole interface for our definition. So what we're going to do is we're going to insert two simple outputs that are basically components. One of them is a chart and one of them is a 3D view of the form. And in our next video, we're actually going to create a custom diagram output of the section. So, but before we get to that, we have to understand something about how the script is working now. Because again, in our introduction video, we just started to link up different bits of numbers and things into our window and have it display and create a chart, and that was pretty simple. However, now that we have a feedback loop established, we can run into some problems and we have to use a different method for creating an output. So let's just look at a very simple element, which is the create a 3D view. So this just takes our model. So you input that here, and you can choose what color you want to display it in. And there's even an option to apply a texture to it using this set 3D view textured. But let's just keep it simple now. Let's say we want a gray instead of a red. And so now this is super simple, and all you have to do is add this to our list of elements to add to the window. So if you remember, we have all of these inputs in one single container, and that goes into the add elements window. So let's just add this one in there as well. And there it is. However, you might have noticed that this started to freak out as soon as I added it. And it says, if you read, it'll say, in general, it's not a good idea to drive the creation of elements with the result of a value listener. So what this means is that, and you can see if I just leave it the way it is and actually start to try to change it, something weird's going to happen. Let's, for the sake of speed, let's just disable this one. And so we're just updating the actual form. So when I try to move this, everything freaks out. And sometimes it won't even let me do anything. I can still move this, but changing any of these sliders to modify this form is becoming a problem. So why is that? When it was very easy for us to just link stuff up from our model and just display it on the window in our introduction video. The reason is that now, when we've got the window updating the definition and the definition updating the model, which is also updating the window again, you set up a cycle where it has to just keep refreshing at a crazy rate, and it just doesn't really work at all. And that's why this is turned yellow. This is turned yellow because it detects that what you're putting into it is dependent on modifications that are made in the window, if that makes any sense. So there is a way to get around it. And the way to get around it is using one of these in the UI output tab. And so each of these will correspond to one of the UI elements that can run into these problems. So for example, set3dView can run into this problem. And the way that we fix it is creating this component. Now, what this does is it doesn't refresh whatever information is fed into here is not causing the entire window to refresh. It's just causing this one element to change. So you could easily change a value here and have that only change this value here. And so you don't run into the problem of having the entire interface bogged down with loops. So the way that this has to work is that we have to actually disconnect our object from this 3D component. And this might be a bit confusing or counterintuitive, but the way that it works is that whatever is connected here can't be updated by whatever we do here. So, and it doesn't even matter what you choose. You could just create any. It asks for a mesh, but it works with BREPs just as well. So if we just create any sphere and we link it up to here, so you get a sphere. However, I can modify, this is a modifier to this element, so I can just connect it here, and whatever mesh or BREP I link up to this input is then going to be changed here. So that is now working. Now, when you just suddenly modify things like that, it can create just weird changes to the views. So let's just close it and reopen it. So there's our window. It's still a bit too small and we have to resize it, but we'll fix that later. So there it is. And the whole point is that now, when I modify the radius, it's working properly and fast. And any changes that I make to this are being reflected in the actual form. And that's kind of how it's supposed to work. It's a bit counterintuitive to just insert any old geometry to the original component just so it has something to feed in for a start, and then for everything that happens later, it's being updated by the real one. But that's how it has to work. So hopefully that makes sense. And we're going to try again to make another chart that feeds into this. So you can see how it works in a different context. So let's close this and let's decide what we actually want in our chart. And so what would be quite useful to show isn't really the number of floors, because that's already displayed. It isn't really the floor-to-floor heights, because you've already got those in your modifier. On your window interface. So what would be really useful is to see the total area being generated for each of these different programs by the inputs that you're creating. So let's just activate this again, and since we already have these floors, all that we have to do now is again, this really doesn't have much to do with human UI, so just suffice it to say, let's flatten this. Let's measure the areas. And then let's just put them into groups according to our list here. Actually, but remember that, and we can do that using partition list. So that should be done very neatly. So if this has a 2, then it'll take the first group will be the first 2, then the next 5 will be the next group, and that should work quite well, and it should add up correctly. So we just put our areas into here, and actually this isn't very useful anymore because this isn't what the user has typed in. What the user has put into here is this list. These are the real floor heights. So we put in these as, the floor numbers, and we put these in as a reference, and so now that's split up into groups according to which floor. We just add them all up. So that gives us our area totals for each of the different programs, commercial, office, residential, amenities. And let's just make this an integer because it's area. And that's what we want to chart. So let's go back and create a chart. And once again, it asks for the list of values to be charted. It's this. We have to flatten it. It asks for the names of the data items to be charted. So that would be this. And the title of the chart should be, actually let's look at this already as a part of our window, just to see what we're doing. Once again, the window has popped up where it tells us, you know, you're doing something wrong with the way you're handling feedback. But let's just look at what's going on here. So there is our chart at the moment, at the bottom. So what were we doing? We were adding a title. So let's just write floor area and what's next? Subtitle, let's just write square meters. And what type of chart do we want? Let's just create a donut chart, why not? And so once again, we're going to run into the same problem where if we try to modify, actually let's organize this bottom row the way that we did the top. So let's create another container that's going to stack them horizontally instead of just having them, you know, piled vertically. So let's just close this, and we're going to want to create another one of these, but with our outputs. So into the first one will be this, our 3D shape. Output, in fact, let's just group these and label them. And the next one, which is our chart. Let's not group it yet because we're not done. And so once again, we have our container component, and you just, whichever you want to go first, 3D view, then the chart, and then have this plugged in. So all of these are our inputs, and actually that's worth labeling, isn't it? And so that goes in first, that goes in second. Again, it's flashing yellow because we haven't fixed the feedback problem. And so now, whoops, one of these isn't correct. When some of them don't register, once you restart the window, just disable them. You might want to close this as well. So let's enable them. So there it is. Sometimes this requires you to kind of do the Grasshopper version of rebooting the component. So there they are. Now they're stacked horizontally, and then on whatever other outputs that we want, we can just plug them in here, and they're going to be added horizontally to our output. And this is still a bit messy, but once we've got all of our different UI components ready, then we're going to look at another way of organizing all of this, which is in a much neater grid. But for the moment, this is okay. So once again, this is flashing. There's a feedback problem. If you try to change anything here, it's going to go crazy. It's not going to let you because, once again, this chart is relying on something that you're doing in this window. So once again, we have to go back and use one of these. So UI output, and there's actually one here for a chart. And you can tell they're all of the red ones. So there's a red component here to set all of the contents of this chart. So you set this here, and now we have a problem because this chart was created with things that are changed by the window. So what's the problem? Our areas. The areas come from this process that is influenced by what happens in our window. The program labels aren't a problem because nothing's modifying them, but this is a problem. So what we can do is, once again, what we did here, just introduce a dummy list or a dummy object that won't be modified by anything in the window, and then have the real stuff plug into this modifier. So this input is the problem, and it's just a list of 4 values. Well, we just have a random list of 4 values here. I mean, this isn't an elegant way of doing it, but that's what works in this system. And then you just introduce that data, new values to include in chart. So that is these. There they are. And so now, once you open this window, you should be able to change any of these and have the pie chart be updated in real time, showing the area totals for each use. So now we've got the form here. We've got a quick pie chart showing us the area. What we might also want to do is have a quick section be drawn with the heights of each and every floor, just to give us a reference of what's going on with our tower, how tall is it, and just showing what the basic form doesn't show us, which is the distribution of the floors. So let's do that next. And just another thing that's worth mentioning, let's just shove this to one side. Another part of what you can modify in a chart, and these charts are super useful for visualizing any sort of data. You can change the chart appearance. So just once again, this is a modifier for the contents, and this is a modifier for the appearance of the chart. And you can see that the form is the colors are a bit different for the components. And then if you click here, then it shows the name. So you punch this in, and the most interesting thing that you can do here is actually start to change the colors. So just adding lots of color swatches. Say we want this to be our first color. Now everything is that color. Second color. Now I've got two colors, and it'll just use as many colors as you want to feed into it. And that kind of works. So you can go ahead and modify the color scheme the way that you want it and create a really snazzy looking kind of output. And at this point, you might not even need to have Grasshopper open in order to observe what's happening. So you can change basically anything. Here, the model's being changed, and the data that comes out of the model's being changed. And it's all happening in a kind of a very presentation-friendly way. So in the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to create a custom output component. At this moment, we're just using components from the UI, but we're going to create our own diagram and use that as the last bit of our interface.